In the heart of Dodge City, a crooked judge offered cowboys a wife for free. Any woman they wanted, lined up like cattle. But when one lone rider pointed to the girl in chains, broken and forgotten, he set off a storm that would tear the town apart. This is the story of betrayal, blood, and the truth that no chains could silence. The sun over Dodge City had a way of burning the truth bare, stripping men of their illusions until all that remained was dust, sweat, and the weight of their choices. On that particular afternoon, the heat pressed down so heavy it seemed the whole town held its breath. Folks gathered at the courthouse porch, not because justice was about to be served, but because Judge Clayburn promised them a show. He always did. Clayburn reclined in his chair like a king on a throne, a cigar pinched between his fingers, his smirk curling beneath the brim of his hat. His voice carried the slick tone of a man too certain he owned every soul within earshot. "Pick any wife for free, gentlemen. Don't be shy now. Step up and claim your prize." The words rippled through the crowd, drawing nervous laughter, a few drunken cheers, and more than a few eyes that glanced away, ashamed but unwilling to speak against him. On the steps before the judge stood a row of women, each one lined up like cattle for market. They had been scrubbed just enough to pass for presentable. Hair brushed, dresses patched, faces powdered to disguise fatigue. Some looked resigned, some defiant, but most wore expressions emptied of hope. And then there was her. She stood at the far end, as out of place among them as a broken blade on a jeweler's table. Shackles bit into her ankles, the iron rusted, gnawing grooves into skin already raw. Her dress was no more than a rag clinging to a body that bore too many bruises, and her hair hung long and tangled, a curtain shielding her face. She leaned against a porch post like it was the only thing holding her upright. While the crowd's eyes skimmed over the other women with quick assessments of worth, no one lingered on her. To the townsfolk, she was invisible. A blemish. A warning. No one looked at her, except Elias Graves. Elias had been standing at the edge of the street, leaning against a hitching post, the wide brim of his hat tilted low. To most, he was just another cowboy passing through, a quiet man whose silence spoke louder than words. But those who knew his name knew the rumors. His revolver had spoken where his voice had not, and the sound of it had ended more than one dispute in blood. His kind of stillness carried weight, the kind that made men second-guess their courage. And in that stillness, he watched the girl. When Judge Clayburn repeated his invitation, "Go on, take your pick. No man here will stop you," a ripple of chuckles moved through the crowd. That was when Elias pushed off the post and started walking. His boots struck the earth in slow, deliberate rhythm, each step scattering, puffs of dust that drifted into the light. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. Whispers hissed like rattlesnakes in the heat. By the time Elias stopped at the foot of the courthouse steps, the laughter had died altogether. He raised his chin just enough for his voice to carry, flat and certain. "Her." The word sliced the silence clean in two. For a moment, no one seemed to breathe. Clayburn blinked, his smirk freezing into something sharper. "Her?" His voice dripped amusement, the kind meant to humiliate. "Boy, that one's not fit to keep a dog company, let alone a man. You can do better." But Elias didn't blink, didn't move. His gaze held steady. "I said her." The girl stirred at the sound, her head lifting the slightest fraction, enough for the sun to reveal the bruise painted across her cheekbone, the thin crust of dried blood along her lip. For the first time, her eyes cut through the curtain of her hair and locked with his. They were not the eyes of a broken woman. They were sharp, defiant, alive. Eyes that asked a question without words. "Will you stand? Will you stay?" Clayburn leaned forward, searching Elias's face for the bluff, for the weakness, for the tell. Then he snapped his fingers at his deputies. "Fine, unlock her. Let the cowboy learn the hard way what happens when a man plays savior." 2 deputies moved toward her. One grabbed her arm, squeezing too hard, while the other fumbled at his belt for the key. Elias was already moving. His hand brushed the deputy's hip, plucking the key free with the kind of ease that suggested practice. He knelt, his broad frame casting a shadow across the girl's bare feet, and unlocked the chains himself. The iron clanged as it hit the porch, the sound louder than gunfire in the tense air. Red welts scored her ankles where the shackles had cut into her skin. She didn't thank him, didn't even look at him. She simply shifted her feet on the splintered boards, the silence between them louder than any word she might have spoken. Elias rose. "Let's go." He held out his hand. She stared at it a long moment, as though weighing whether touching it would save her or damn her. Then, slowly, she slid her fingers into his. The crowd murmured, shifting like cattle sensing a storm. Clayburn's laugh followed them down the steps, oily and certain. "You'll regret this, boy. That girl's not just trouble. She's a rope waiting for a neck, and when it tightens, it won't be hers." The words clung like burrs. As they walked into the street, the town seemed to breathe differently. Women clutched their children tighter. Men glanced away, shaking their heads. Whispers followed in their wake. "She's the one." "You know what she did?" "He won't last the week." A woman in a blue bonnet dragged her son aside as though the girl carried some plague. Raya, he didn't know her name yet, but it would be etched into him soon enough, walked barefoot on the dirt, her steps uneven, from the cuts at her ankles, yet she leaned on no one. The tremor in her hand was there, yes, but not from fear. This was something else, something heavier, like she was carrying knowledge too dangerous to speak aloud. They reached his horse, a bay mare named Dusty, tied to the post. Elias lifted her into the saddle with quiet care. As he swung up behind, settling one arm around her to steady her, a voice rang out from the shadows. "Graves." Sheriff Randall Doss stepped into the light, arms crossed, his silver badge flashing like a warning. His face was carved from stone, his eyes hard as granite. "You sure you know what you're taking home?" the sheriff asked. Elias's jaw clenched. "I know enough." The sheriff's gaze slid to the girl. His mouth twitched into something between pity and disdain. "Enough to hang you, maybe. Tell him, girl. Tell him what you saw that day." Her lips parted. For an instant, Elias thought she might speak. But then she closed them again, her jaw tight, her silence deliberate. The sheriff shook his head, spitting into the dirt. "She won't, because she knows the second she does, you'll drop her like a hot coal." Judge Clayburn gave her a choice, chains or a grave. And if you think you can change that ending, you're a bigger fool than I thought. Elias guided Dusty forward, his body a wall between the sheriff and the girl. "You done?" Doss didn't move, but his eyes followed them as they rode into the street, sharp and sure as rifle sights. Behind them, Judge Clayburn leaned back in his chair again, puffing his cigar, watching with the satisfied patience of a man who had just lit a fuse and was waiting for the explosion. The courthouse shrank behind them, but its shadow stretched longer than the road ahead. And though Elias didn't yet know it, that single word, her, had already rewritten his life. Because some choices in the West weren't just choices. They were battles. And once you stepped into them, there was no turning back. The prairie had a way of swallowing sound, leaving only the wind and the creak of leather as Elias Graves rode west with the girl balanced before him on Dusty's back. The town behind them had dissolved into the shimmer of heat, but Elias knew its eyes still clung to them. Dodge City had a long reach, and Judge Clayburn's shadow stretched farther than most men dared to imagine. He said nothing as they rode. Neither did she. The silence between them was its own kind of weight, heavier than the dust settling on their clothes, and Elias let it sit, knowing sometimes words only broke what silence could protect. When the sun began to sink, they turned into a dry creek bed, following its crooked spine until Elias found a shallow pool trickling between stones. He dismounted and offered her his hand, but she slid down without it, landing barefoot in the dust. Her ankles, raw from iron, flinched at the touch of gravel, but she made no sound. Elias watered Dusty, then built a fire from twisted mesquite branches. He tore a strip of jerky from his pack, broke it in two, and held out half. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing his with a quick, instinctive recoil. For a long time they ate in silence, the flames licking shadows against the canyon wall. The stars came first in singles, then in clusters, the prairie sky a black ocean full of lights. Finally, Elias spoke, his voice even, low. "You got a name?" Her gaze lingered on the fire before she answered. "Raya." Elias let the name settle, as if testing the weight of it. It fit the sharpness in her eyes, the refusal to be erased even when half the town had pretended not to see her. He nodded once, then leaned back against a rock. Raya pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her hair falling loose, framing a face still marked by bruises. She didn't look at him when she said, almost in a whisper, "I didn't kill anyone." Elias didn't flinch. He'd expected as much. Then who did? Her throat tightened, but she forced the words out. "Clayburn, 3 weeks ago. Marshal Dugan came to the courthouse after dark, said the judge was stealing land, fixing deeds, bleeding widows dry. I was sweeping the hall when I heard them. The marshal called him a thief. Clayburn laughed. Then he shot him, in the back, like a coward." The crackle of the fire filled the silence that followed. Elias's jaw clenched, but his eyes stayed steady on her. "And you saw it?" Raya's head dipped. "I ran, but his men caught me before I made it to the street. They said I'd done it. Said I'd hang unless I kept quiet. But Clayburn, he had another plan. He told them to sell me off. Said it would make me vanish without a grave for anyone to visit." Her voice broke, but she pressed her lips tight, as if even grief had to be rationed. Elias studied her face. There was fear, yes, but beneath it something stronger, something unbroken. He had seen men fall apart under less. "And the proof?" Elias asked. Her eyes finally met his, sharp through the haze of smoke. "There's a ledger, behind the wall of his bench. Every name, every theft, every lie, it's all there." Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring into the fire. He knew what that meant. Proof wasn't just survival, it was war. He reached into his saddlebag, pulled out his revolver, and laid it on the ground between them. Then he slid it toward her. Raya froze, her hands tightening around the blanket. "What's this?" "Take it." "I don't know how." "Then you'll learn." His voice left no room for refusal. "If Clayburn wants you dead, you won't get a choice. Out here, you fight or you fall." Slowly, she reached for the weapon. The iron looked heavy in her hands, as though it carried not just weight but consequence. Elias guided her grip, adjusted her stance when she rose, showed her how to breathe before the squeeze, not after. They used a line of empty tins he'd been carrying. The first shot startled her, a wild echo that cracked across the canyon, ricocheting against the stone. She grimaced, but didn't stop. By the fifth shot, her hands had steadied. By the seventh, she hit the can. The sound of it toppling brought a flash of something unfamiliar to her face. Not joy exactly, but power. Elias watched, saying nothing. He remembered teaching his sister once, long ago before Clayburn's lies had stolen her ranch and, with it, her will to live. The memory sat heavy in his chest, but he kept it buried. The girl didn't need his ghosts. She had enough of her own. Later, when the fire was nothing but glowing coals, Raya spoke again. "Why did you pick me? You could have walked away." Elias's eyes stayed on the stars. "Because nobody else would." She studied him, her expression unreadable. He offered nothing more. He never did, but the truth was simpler and heavier than he'd admit. He'd seen something in her eyes on that porch, something that mirrored the fire he'd buried after his sister's death. A refusal to be erased. The night carried them in silence again, broken only by the crackle of cooling embers and the distant howl of a coyote. But the silence had shifted. Where before it was weight, now it was a thread, thin but strong, binding them in the dark. At dawn, Elias packed the mare, and they rode on. The prairie opened before them, endless and indifferent but not empty. Every mile carried the echo of hoofbeats behind them, the knowledge that men were hunting, not just for coin, but for silence. By midday, they spotted dust rising on the horizon. Riders. Elias cursed under his breath, scanning the ridges. He steered Dusty off the open trail, down into the cover of tall grass and dry arroyos. Raya clutched the saddle horn, her body stiff, her eyes fixed behind them. The riders drew closer, their shadows stretching long in the sun. Elias angled them into a washout, the terrain narrowing until the ground itself became their shield. When the first gunshot split the air, Dusty lunged forward, hooves pounding against the hardpack. Elias twisted in the saddle, firing back, the report of his Colt sharp as lightning. One of the riders peeled off, his horse rearing, but the others pressed on. Raya didn't scream. She didn't cry. She grabbed Elias's spare revolver from the saddlebag with trembling hands, her eyes wide but steady. When a rider closed in on their flank, she lifted the weapon, exhaled, and pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, but close enough to spook the man's horse, sending it stumbling sideways. Elias glanced at her, and for the first time, he let the corner of his mouth twitch into something close to approval. They pushed Dusty hard until the gunfire faded behind them, the riders left lost in the labyrinth of canyons. When at last they stopped, both horse and riders gasping for breath, Elias reached for his canteen and handed it to her first. She drank, her lips trembling, then handed it back. Her voice was low, hoarse from dust and fear. "They won't stop." Elias wiped his mouth after a swallow, eyes hard on the horizon. "Then neither will we." The words hung in the air, heavy as the weight of the revolvers at their sides. The hunt had begun in earnest, and Elias knew the judge would send more men, each one hungrier for blood than the last. But he also knew something else, something the judge hadn't counted on. Raya wasn't a chained girl anymore. She was a witness, a fighter, and maybe the only person alive who could burn Clayburn's empire to the ground. And Elias Graves had just chosen to stand beside her. The abandoned silver mine near Santa Fe had long been stripped of its riches, but to Elias Graves and Raya it offered the only wealth that mattered now: concealment. The air inside was cool and damp, heavy with the smell of rust and stone, and the silence pressed close as though the earth itself wanted to swallow them whole. They lit a lantern, its thin flame casting jagged shadows against the black rock, and for the first time in days they allowed themselves to stop. Raya sat wrapped in a blanket, her knees drawn close, her bruises fading but not forgotten. Elias tended to Dusty at the mine's entrance, brushing sweat from the mare's flanks. When he finally joined her near the fire, he studied her for a long while, saying nothing, waiting for her to speak on her own terms. She had been carrying a weight heavier than chains, and he knew better than to pry it free with questions. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but sharp, every word edged with memory. She told him how Clayburn's men had dragged her into the courthouse after Marshal Dugan fell, how they accused her of the killing, how they laughed as they bound her in the cell, whispering that no one would care enough to ask the truth. She had pleaded, not for herself, but for them to see what the judge had done. They told her to keep her mouth shut or she'd be hanging from a rope before sundown. But Clayburn had another idea. He would turn her into something worse than a corpse. He would erase her. Her eyes glimmered in the dim firelight as she recalled the words he had spoken. Chains or a grave, girl. And I'm giving you the kind choice. The memory still carved its mark into her, but as she spoke it aloud, her voice grew steadier, harder, as if sharing the wound also cauterized it. Elias listened, his hands clasped loosely between his knees. He had seen corruption wear many masks, but there was something in Clayburn's cruelty that struck deeper, as though the man took pleasure in not only breaking lives, but in making the broken vanish without trace. When Raya fell silent, Elias leaned forward, his voice low. He can't erase you, not while you remember, not while there's proof. Her head lifted, eyes locked on his. You believe me? He met her gaze without hesitation. I do. Her lips parted, and for the first time since he had freed her from those chains, a hint of relief flickered across her face. A small crack in the armor she'd forged to survive. But almost as quickly it was gone, replaced by something else. Fire. She told him then of the ledgers, hidden in the false wall behind Clayburn's bench. Thick with ink, they contained every theft, every bribe, every betrayal that kept the judge's empire standing. She had heard him ordering his clerk to tuck them away, laughing about how no one would ever find them. Elias's jaw tightened as the truth settled in. With those ledgers, Clayburn could be stripped bare before the town. Without them, Raya's testimony would be dismissed as the lies of a desperate fugitive. The path was as clear as it was perilous. We go back, Elias said. Raya shook her head sharply. That courthouse is a fortress. You don't know how many rifles guard it, how many men would die before letting the judge fall. Elias shrugged. Then we'll count on their arrogance. Men who think they own the law rarely expect anyone to steal it out from under them. Her silence stretched. Finally, she whispered, You'd risk your life for this? For me? He stared into the flame, his expression unreadable. I've already buried one sister because of men like Clayburn. I won't bury another soul to his lies. The words hung heavy, and for the first time he spoke of her. His sister, Ruth, had owned a small ranch near Abilene. Clayburn's men had rewritten deeds, claimed she owed taxes she never did, and stripped the land from her hands. By the time Elias returned from a cattle drive, Ruth was gone, her spirit broken under the weight of betrayal. It was then Elias had sworn never again to stand by while corruption devoured the defenseless. Raya reached across the fire and touched his hand. Not in comfort, not in pity, but in recognition. Their scars were different, but they had been carved by the same hand. The days that followed in the mine became something else. While the world outside hunted them, inside they forged themselves into more than fugitives. Elias trained Raya with the revolver, showing her how to keep her arms steady, how to use her breath to quiet the tremor in her hands. She was clumsy at first, but persistence became her ally, and soon she struck her targets with a determination that startled even Elias. He did not soften his words, and she did not need him to. She wanted truth, not comfort. At night, as the lantern dimmed, Raya confessed she had a younger brother, left behind years ago when work at the courthouse promised wages they desperately needed. She had not seen him since. Her greatest fear wasn't dying. It was disappearing before he knew she had fought back. Elias told her she had already done more than most. Survival in itself was rebellion, but he promised her something more. If they lived, they would find the boy. One evening, a storm rolled across the desert, rain hammering the rocks like drums. Lightning lit the mine's entrance, and the two of them watched from the shadows. Elias spoke then, more to himself than to her. Every storm clears the air, but it always takes something with it. Question is, what's left standing after? Raya's reply was firm. We will be. The storm passed, but its echo lingered in their resolve. When dawn broke over Santa Fe, Elias saddled Dusty and turned toward the east. The horizon burned red, the road ahead long, and Raya climbed onto the mare without waiting for his hand. Neither of them said it aloud, but both knew the truth. They weren't running anymore. They were riding, back into the lion's den, not to survive, but to strike. What lay waiting in Dodge City was a battle they could not escape, and perhaps could not win. But they carried something Clayburn could never chain, the certainty that justice, once spoken, could not be unsaid. As the mine vanished behind them, Elias glanced at Raya, her face set against the rising sun. In her eyes he saw the shift. No longer the girl in chains, no longer a prisoner of silence, but a woman prepared to turn memory into a weapon. And he knew then that whatever fate waited in Dodge City, they would face it together. The night they rode back into Dodge City, the streets felt like a graveyard holding its breath. Lantern light flickered in windows, but no one lingered outside. The town had heard the rumors by then, about the cowboy who stole the girl in chains, about the judge who wanted her silenced at any cost. Elias Graves and Raya moved like shadows along the back alleys, keeping Dusty close to the walls, each hoof step muffled against packed dirt. Neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer distance but intent, stretched taut with the knowledge of what they had come to do. The courthouse loomed ahead, its pale walls catching the moonlight, casting it into something ghostly and foreboding. Elias had faced men with guns, outlaws with nothing to lose, but he had never walked so willingly into the jaws of power. He dismounted, tying Dusty to a post in the shadows, then helped Raya down. She refused his hand, steadying herself on her own feet. Her eyes locked on the building where her life had been stolen, and Elias saw no fear there, only resolve. She led him to the rear of the courthouse, where a rusted drainage grate sat half-buried in earth. The metal groaned as Elias pried it loose, the sound echoing far too loud in the night. Together they crawled into the dark crawlspace, dust and cobwebs clinging to their clothes, the smell of old wood and damp earth pressing close. Above them came the muffled rumble of voices, men gathered in Clayburn's court long past midnight. He wasn't just passing judgment. He was preparing for war. Raya pressed her hand against the wall, counting boards until she stopped. "Here," she whispered. Elias took his knife and levered the panel free. Behind it, hidden in the hollow, were the ledgers. He pulled them out, their leather covers stiff, their pages thick with ink. Names, dates, numbers, all the blood and bones of Clayburn's empire laid bare. Elias felt the weight of them. Proof, undeniable and final. But it wasn't enough to have it. They had to show it. Raya's eyes burned in the lantern light. "We can't just take them. If we run, he'll find a way to bury this again. It has to happen here, in front of them all." For a moment, Elias stared at her. He had half expected her to want escape, to run until Clayburn's reach withered in the dust. But she was right. The judge's power didn't come from the gun on his hip or the gold in his pocket. It came from the belief that he was untouchable. That belief had to die. He nodded. They moved toward the trapdoor beneath the judge's bench. Elias pushed it open, and together they rose into the light of the room. The courtroom stilled. Dozens of armed men turned, rifles raised, faces hard with surprise. Judge Clayburn froze behind his bench, the smug certainty on his face melting into shock, then rage. "Shoot them!" he barked. But Raya's voice cut through, sharp and unwavering, stronger than the crack of any gun. "You'll want to hear this first." She stepped forward, the bruises still visible on her face, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She opened a ledger, her fingers trembling but her voice steady. "Here it is. Every man Clayburn stole from. Every widow he bled dry. And the night he murdered Marshal Dugan in cold blood." A ripple moved through the crowd. Men shifted, exchanging uncertain glances. A rancher near the front, a man Elias recognized from long-ago cattle drives, stood with fury in his eyes. "Is it true, Judge? Did you kill the marshal?" Clayburn's mouth opened, but the words tangled, the smooth lies failing him now. Elias pulled another ledger from the sack and hurled it across the room. Sheriff Randall Doss caught it, flipping through the pages, his jaw hardening as he read the names, the signatures, the theft laid out in ink. "It's all here," the sheriff said, his voice heavy. "Every word of it." The tide shifted in that instant. Guns that had been pointed at Elias and Raya began to waver, then to swing toward the bench. Clayburn saw it, saw his empire unraveling before his eyes. Desperation twisted his face as his hand darted toward the drawer where Elias knew he kept a pistol. Elias's revolver fired first. The shot shattered the drawer, splinters flying, the bullet slamming into the wood an inch from Clayburn's hand. The judge froze, the weight of silence collapsing on him. "You're done," Elias said, his voice flat, his aim steady. The sheriff stepped forward, badge glinting in the lamplight. "By the authority of this county, Clayburn, you're under arrest for theft, fraud, and the murder of Marshal Dugan." Deputies moved in, rifles drawn, the crowd pressing closer, anger spilling into shouts. Years of silence broke loose, men demanding answers, women demanding justice, voices swelling until the courthouse walls trembled with the force of it. Through it all, Raya stood tall, the chains of memory falling away with every word she spoke. "You thought silence would bury me. You thought fear would erase me. But I am still here. And so is the truth." Clayburn's face collapsed into something pitiful then, anger crumbling into fear. He was dragged from behind his bench, the same porch where he had once mocked the powerless, now waiting to bear witness to his fall. Elias lowered his gun, but didn't holster it. He watched the crowd, watched the years of pain erupt into fury, and he knew the danger wasn't over. A man like Clayburn didn't just die in chains. His reach lingered in the men he had bought, in the lies he had sold. But tonight, something had shifted. Tonight, the people of Dodge had seen what he truly was. Outside, the air was cold and still. Elias and Raya stepped into it together, the burlap sack of ledgers clutched in his hand. The courthouse behind them roared with the chaos of a tyrant's fall, but in the night air there was space to breathe, to believe that maybe justice could stand on its own legs. At the hitching post, Elias lifted Raya onto Dusty's back. For the first time since he had met her, she looked not like a prisoner, not like a fugitive, but like someone who had chosen her place in the world. She met his eyes, her voice low but certain. It's not over. Men like him don't vanish just because you put them in chains." Elias swung into the saddle behind her, his arm braced around her waist. "Then we'll make sure it ends." As Dusty carried them into the dark, the courthouse shrank behind them, its lanterns flickering like dying stars. But ahead lay the open road, and for the first time, Elias felt that their path was not just flight but purpose. Raya had given the people the truth, and now it was theirs to carry. Whatever fight remained, they would meet it together. And in the silence that followed, heavy with the echo of all that had been spoken, Elias understood something new. The girl he had chosen on that porch had chosen her fight long before him. All he had done was step beside her. The night after Judge Clayburn was dragged from his own bench, Dodge City was restless. Lamps burned late in windows, voices carried in whispers down empty streets, and the air itself seemed unsettled, as if the town could not quite believe that its tyrant had fallen. Inside the courthouse, the deputies held their prisoner under lock, but outside, the town wrestled with something larger than the man. They had lived too long under his shadow, and even with his ledgers opened, with every theft and every name spilling across those pages, people asked themselves the same question. What now? Elias Graves and Raya did not linger to find out. The courthouse echoed with shouts, accusations and arguments about what would come next, but they had no part in it. Their fight had never been about holding power. It had been about tearing power's mask away. When Elias saddled Dusty and lifted Raya onto her back, the people hardly noticed them go. They were no longer the focus. The truth was. And that was enough. The prairie swallowed them quickly, the town lights shrinking into the horizon. The stars stretched wide, brilliant against the dark. And for the first time since Elias had seen her in chains, Raya breathed without the weight of eyes following her every step. She held the ledgers tight in her lap, the ink smudging onto her hands, as though she couldn't let them out of her grasp even for a moment. Elias said nothing, but he noticed. Truth had a way of binding itself to those who carried it. When they finally stopped, it was on the edge of a ridge where the land rolled endlessly into shadows and moonlight. They built no fire, better to remain unseen, but lay back against the earth, staring into the sky. For a long while neither spoke. The silence between them had shifted once again. It was no longer wary, no longer heavy, but companionable, like the quiet between two travelers who know their roads have fused into one. Raya broke it first. "I don't know what comes next." Her voice was low, almost swallowed by the wind. "I thought I'd die in those chains. Now I've spoken the truth in front of every man who would have sworn I was guilty. But I still feel—" She paused, searching. "Untethered." Elias turned his head toward her. "That's freedom." She gave a faint smile, one without joy but with something sturdier. "Feels like falling." "Sometimes it is," Elias said. "But it's better than rotting where they put you." The horizon began to pale with dawn. Elias rose and saddled Dusty again, and Raya climbed up without his help. Her ankles still bore the marks of iron, but she didn't stumble now. They rode south at first, skirting wagon roads and settlements where Clayburn's men might still linger, but everywhere they went, whispers followed. Word traveled faster than hooves, and people knew of the girl who stood in court and spoke the truth, and of the cowboy who stood beside her. Some offered bread or water, others only silence and watchful eyes, but Elias saw the shift. Fear had cracked. The judge's empire had been built on silence, and now silence was broken. 2 days later, they reached a small settlement nestled against a cottonwood grove. Elias tied Dusty at the well, while Raya went into the mercantile. When she returned, she carried paper and ink. That night she sat by the fire and wrote by lantern light, her head bent, her hand steady. Elias watched without asking until she folded the sheet carefully and pressed it to her chest. "My brother," she said softly. "I don't know if he'll ever read it, but I have to try." Elias nodded. There was nothing to add. He understood the need to speak across distance, to stitch together what the world had torn apart. The next morning, as they passed through the cottonwoods, Raya asked, "And you? When this is over, when the last of Clayburn's men are gone, what will you do?" Elias considered. For years his life had been nothing but drifting trails, cattle drives, and the shadow of a sister he had failed to save. For the first time, the thought of something more settled into him. "A ranch," he said finally. "Not much. Enough land for horses. Maybe a place where people who've been run off, cheated, hunted, where they can start again." Raya looked at him, her expression unreadable, then nodded once. "A place that gives back what Clayburn took. That's the idea." They rode on, but the world had not forgotten them. On the outskirts of another town, nailed to a post, Elias saw it. A fresh broadside, the ink dark and new. His own face sketched in heavy strokes. Beneath it, hers. Wanted, for murder, for theft, for crimes they hadn't committed. Even with Clayburn in chains, his lies still ran through the territory like poison. Elias tore it down, folding the paper into his vest. Raya's voice was calm. "He still has men, still has gold." "He has less every day," Elias replied. But the danger was clear. They could not linger in towns where greed was stronger than truth. So they kept moving, riding deeper into the prairie, where the land stretched wide and law had not yet chosen a face. And as they rode, Raya's voice carried steady beside him. "He tried to bury me with silence. If I vanish now, he wins, so we don't vanish. We keep speaking. We keep showing them." Elias turned to her. The bruises on her face had faded, but her eyes burned with something fierce, something untouchable. "You're not the girl in chains anymore," he said quietly. "No," she answered, "and I never will be again." By the time the sun set, they reached a crossroads where a weather-worn sign leaned in the dust. One arm pointed west, the paint nearly gone, but the words still legible. "New beginnings, 27 miles." Raya's lips curved into a faint smile. Elias touched the brim of his hat. Without speaking, they turned Dusty toward it. The prairie opened before them, wild and uncertain, but no longer empty. For the first time, the road ahead was not just flight, it was possibility. Behind them, Dodge City would wrestle with its own ghosts. The judge's chair would sit empty, his ledgers passed from hand to hand, his name carved into history not as a man of law, but as a thief and murderer. The people would decide what to make of the truth now that it had been dragged into the open. But Elias and Raya did not look back. Their fight was never just about surviving Clayburn. It was about choosing something greater than fear, about stepping into the unknown with nothing but each other, and the conviction that the West, in all its cruelty, still had room for justice. As the stars began to prick the sky and the horizon deepened into night, Elias glanced once at Raya. She sat tall, the letter to her brother tucked safely in her bag, her hands steady on the saddle horn. He thought then of the day he first saw her in chains, a figure no one else dared to look at. And he understood now that his choice on that porch had been more than defiance. It had been recognition. The prairie wind rose, carrying the scent of rain, and Dusty's hooves struck steady against the earth. The road stretched long, but they rode it together, and that was enough. Whatever came, whether more lies, more hunters, or more battles, they had already broken the silence that Clayburn had tried to weave around them. And once broken, silence could never be mended. The girl in chains was gone. In her place rode a witness, a fighter, a survivor. And beside her rode the cowboy who had chosen her, not out of mercy, but out of truth. Together, they carried that truth into the vast wild, where every mile was a question and every dawn a chance for an answer. The story of Elias Graves and Raya is one that begins in silence and ends in a voice too loud to ignore. It is the story of a cowboy who made a choice on a courthouse porch, and a woman who refused to let her truth be buried beneath chains. It is, at its heart, the story of two people who carried scars carved by injustice and chose not to bow to it, but to stand against it, no matter the cost. It began under the merciless sun of Dodge City, Kansas, when Judge Clayburn turned justice into spectacle. Men laughed as women were lined up to be chosen like livestock, each forced into a life she had not asked for. Among them stood one figure set apart, a girl shackled in rusted iron, her body bruised, her spirit hidden behind tangled hair. No one looked at her because to look was to acknowledge the cruelty. No one dared until Elias. His quiet defiance in pointing to her and saying, "Her," was the spark that set everything into motion. That single moment turned him from a wanderer into a man with a cause. From that day forward, they were hunted. Clayburn unleashed his men across the prairie, promising coin for their capture, dead or alive. And yet, as Elias and Raya fled into the vast silence of the land, a bond began to grow between them. At first, it was a bond of survival, of shared hunger and danger, but soon it became something deeper. Elias saw in Raya not a broken woman, but someone carrying a fire too fierce to be extinguished. Raya, in turn, saw in Elias not just a rescuer, but a man who knew what it meant to lose everything to corruption. In each other, they found both a mirror of pain and a promise of something stronger than fear. Their journey led them into hiding near Santa Fe, in an abandoned silver mine where truth spilled at last. Raya told Elias the story of Marshall Dugan, shot in the back by Clayburn after daring to confront him about stolen land deeds and forged records. She had seen it, and because she had seen it, she had been condemned to vanish. Yet she also carried knowledge of the ledgers hidden behind Clayburn's bench, proof of every crime. It was in that mine that they decided not to run anymore. They would ride back into Dodge, not to escape, but to fight. What came next was not the act of outlaws, but of truth-tellers. In the dead of night, they crept beneath the courthouse, retrieved the ledgers, and rose from the shadows to confront the judge in his own court. Raya stood before the townsfolk and spoke with the strength that chains could not take from her. She named his crimes, held his lies to the fire, and forced the people to see what had been hidden in plain sight. And in that moment, the weight of silence cracked. The sheriff himself read the pages aloud, and the rifles that had once been aimed at Elias and Raya turned against the judge. Power shifted, not because a gun was drawn faster, but because truth was spoken where lies had ruled too long. Clayburn was dragged from his bench, stripped not only of his title, but of the illusion that had shielded him. And while Dodge erupted in the chaos of reckoning, Elias and Raya stepped into the night. They did not stay to revel in victory, because victory was never theirs to keep. It belonged to the people who now had to decide what to make of the truth. Their part had been to light the fire. As they rode out, the land opened before them once more, but this time it was not as fugitives that they traveled. Raya carried a letter for her younger brother, a message across the years that said she had lived, she had fought, and she was no longer bound by silence. Elias carried the thought of a ranch, a place for the broken to begin again, where what was stolen might be restored in new soil. Together they rode toward a crossroads marked by a sign weathered by dust. New beginnings, 27 miles. And they chose that road. Their story is not just a tale of the Wild West. It is a mirror for every time and every place where power is abused and truth is silenced. It asks the question, what do you do when you hold proof against the most powerful man in town? Do you bury it for safety? Do you sell it for coin? Or do you risk everything to show it, knowing the cost might be your life? Elias and Raya chose the last, not because they were fearless, but because they were tired of fear. They understood that silence is the weapon of the oppressor, and that breaking it, even at great risk, is the first step toward freedom. The lesson we take from their story reaches beyond the dust and gunsmoke of the frontier. In our world today, power still twists the truth, wealth still buys silence, and fear still tempts people to look away. But just as Raya discovered, the act of speaking, of standing, of choosing not to be erased, can ripple outward until others find their courage too. Truth is not always safe, but it is always necessary. And courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act despite it. For each of us, the chains may look different. They may be the fear of speaking up at work, the weight of injustice we see in our communities, the silence we keep when we know the truth. But the story of Elias and Raya reminds us that chains are meant to be broken, that no matter how strong the hand of corruption, its strength is an illusion sustained by the quiet compliance of others. When even one voice says, "No more," the illusion cracks, and when another joins and another, the whole structure collapses. So what does it mean for us now? It means remembering that truth matters, even when costly. It means that standing beside those who have been silenced is itself an act of rebellion. It means that when we see injustice, our choice is clear: to look away or to step forward as Elias did, point to the forgotten and say, "Her." The West was wild, but what made it endure in story and legend was not just the gunfights or the cattle drives. It was the people who chose to carve justice out of dust and hardship. Elias and Raya's story is a reminder that even in the harshest lands, courage can change the course of lives. And so can we. If this story moved you, if you believe that tales like these remind us of the power of truth and courage, then support this channel. Subscribe, share, and help us keep bringing you stories from the echoes of the West. Stories of grit, of survival, of the voices that refused to be silenced. Because every time we tell them, we keep the fire alive. And with your support, we can keep writing further into the frontier of history, bringing you the next chapter of the Wild West. Subscribe today, and let's keep the echoes of the West alive together.